Thank you very much, Erica. So I am really delighted to have a friend, a colleague, someone whose work has been a source of inspiration for several years now. Jason Stanley is the Jacob. How do you pronounce the middle?
I just make it up. Uralski.
Uralski. Jacob Uralski, professor of philosophy at Yale University. He's the author of 6 books, including How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, which literally is one of my favorite books, and How Propaganda Works. Stanley is a member of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School and serves on the board of the Prison Policy Initiative, where I think you were sitting with the director when I first met you, when I gave a talk.
Wagner.
That's right, Peter Wagner. He writes frequently about authoritarianism, democracy, propaganda, free speech, and mass incarceration for outlets including the New York Times, The Guardian, The New Republic, and Project Syndicate. So I know we are not in front of a live audience, but if you could join me in welcoming Professor Stanley to this conversation. So listen, I can't think of a more urgent conversation to have. Here we are 19 days away from the US presidential election. And I know that I often feel like, is it me? Am I crazy when I am walking the halls of this campus? I am in conversation with friends and neighbors in social gatherings, and everything seems like it's business as usual. Right?
Yeah.
So you have a very unique story that you've told now in probably 3 books in various ways about being the child of Holocaust survivors. And in your book, How Fascism Works, you talk about your mom and sort of how she was sounding the alarm. Is it your mom or grandmother?
Well, I mean, my grandmother grew up in Germany and came when she was in her late 30s. And so, yes, my grandmother in her memoir.
Yes. Was sounding the alarm about the Nazis coming, and no one was listening.
Yeah.
So just to start this conversation, maybe just set the stage for how you understand the moment we are in 19 days away from the presidential election.
Great. First of all, it's great to be in conversation with you. Some of my formative intellectual conversations were with you in Harlem when you were directing the Schomburg Center, when I was working through the notion of objectivity and its misuse as you study in condemnation. You've had a profound effect on me. So, so my grandmother wrote those, that was talking about 1937 in Berlin. She was doing underground work, going into the concentration camp Sachsenhausen, dressed as a Nazi social worker, taking people out. So she knew what was going on. But even the Berlin Jewish community was like, it's national politics, it's bad, but it'll go away soon. Our capacity to deny reality is very strong until, think about it, when a hurricane hits in Florida, you're like, whatever, it's Florida. Remember COVID, when COVID hit New Rochelle and New Haven, I was like, well, it's not going to affect us in New Haven.
That's right.
So that's how we are psychologically, and we have to know that about ourselves, that unless it's an emergency now in our front yard, it is not there. Like somebody recently, earlier today, someone said, what's the magic rhetorical trick that Donald Trump does here to trick us all, to trick people? And I said, you can't really, and what are you writing about it? I said, you can't really write anything anymore about it because it's all out in the open and all public. So Trump is just being a fascist right out there.
Yeah.
He's saying he's going to use the military to go after his political opponents.
Right.
And the Democrats, and he's talking about the Democrats, like Hitler talked about the Jews, which is, we forget that politicide is also, a crime like that.
And let me just be clear, you said it, but I want to make sure people heard politicide, meaning a variation of homicide, of killing, of murder.
Yeah, politicide and genocide are 2 sides of the same coin. In the Genocide Convention, the Soviet Union didn't want politicide counted as genocide because they didn't want
they wanted to be free to kill their political dissidents.
Exactly. And they didn't want to be blamed for it. So it's just when Indonesia kills 1 million communists in a year, that's not genocide because they're not.
This is how, I mean, it's laughable, but it's absurd and tragic and sad, right? I mean, so I just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah. So, I mean, the situation we face probably, you can never know, but probably won't be that bad. It'll be there's a lot of anticipatory obedience happening right now, people preparing for a fascist regime. We see this at our universities.
So just break that down for a minute, because we heard the same concept in an earlier conversation today. John Palfrey, who's the president of the MacArthur Foundation, in describing their own legal approach to the threats of litigation, said that they are not doing anticipatory compliance.
Right.
You use the word anticipatory and obedience.
Yeah.
And I want to lean into that a bit, because maybe talk about what that looks like.
What that looks like, this is a term, expression Timothy Snyder uses in On Tyranny. What that looks like is universities already now laying the basis for crushing student dissent and protest. So we know that universities have been the site of protests in the Vietnam War. And we know those protests, those anti-war protests laid the basis for Ronald Reagan's attack on universities, University of California system.
As governor
as
in the
governor.
1960s on free speech in particular, when it was this free speech right to the left.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, now we have the free speech right to the left coming back to us, which
Right.
is really nice.
Yeah.
I missed it. So what we have is the university administrators in the last year, the far right, the fascist right, has seen an opening. I mean, these are not people who care about American Jews. Let's be totally frank.
Yeah.
But they
And we'll come back to that, because I think there are people who don't feel that way, right? I mean, I have neighbors
Yeah.
who don't feel that way, and I know people.
I meant the Republican, Stefanik and the Republicans.
Correct.
Who
Okay.
are,
all right. The people who are precisely weaponizing anti-Semitism.
Right, Marjorie Green doesn't care about
anti-Semitism. Got it.
I mean, it's openly laughable,
Right.
Fox News very early on started saying universities are hotbeds of Hamas support. So they've got it. They find, and this is something that you have to see in international perspective. India, when under BJP, started attacking its universities. They had great.
Now, is this Modi's party?
Modi's party,
okay,
yeah.
The Prime Minister of India, just because all our audience may not know all the acronyms.
BJP is the Hindu nationalist party that has been arguing that, trying to create this mythic past for India as a Hindu nationalist state, and Muslims are supposedly invaders and interlopers. So there was a law passed in 2019 called the Citizenship Amendment Act. I won't get into it, but it basically makes Muslims second-class citizens. And there were large-scale protests against this in universities. And India's government cracked down. They were labeled in the press. Universities were labeled as traitorous and anti-India. Professors were fired, of course. So this is when you look at an international perspective, when you look at the comments recently made by, I believe, Stephen Scalise, that they're going to de-accredit universities.
Right.
That's what Orban did.
Or Vice President candidate and current Senator J.D. Vance.
Right.
Professors are the enemy.
Professors are the enemy. I have to be careful about talking about him because he's so loved at Yale. He's a real Yale man. And so everyone just trips over themselves to talk about it.
You are joking, I know.
No, I'm serious.
You really have to be careful talking about him?
No, I'm joking.
Okay, all right, yeah.
But yeah, so that's what the anti-genocide protests gave completely hypocritical people an into this vicious attack on the greatest university system in the world.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing is already laid down the basis for crushing dissent, bringing police on campus, etc., in a future Trump administration. So
I wanted to start big because your book, Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future, goes big. And I want to just lift up a couple of quotes that you use. You have these amazing epigraphs that open the book. And not that I'm not a well-read person, but I mean, you hit the jackpot with regard to finding these very powerful quotes to illustrate the themes of each chapter. So I want to move. First, I want you to describe fascism in ways that our audience will appreciate, because I think people are still learning. And then two, I want to move from sort of fascism up here to the way that fascism lives, or anti-education, as you described, lives within the space of higher education and even within a kind of context of our daily lives. So here are a couple of the quotes. Wars are won by teachers.
Vladimir Putin.
Vladimir Putin. I'm going to test you on your own quotes. Here's another. The Soviet system never commemorated the Holocaust. One reason for this is that once you define and identify one genocide, you can recognize another or other genocidal crimes. The Soviet Empire didn't want us to learn our history.
That's from Victoria Amelina's essay, Nothing Bad Has Ever Happened.
Yeah, powerful.
She, by the way, she was murdered. She was, the Russians bombed a restaurant she was in, killing her at the age of 36. And then they bombed the town square during her funeral, killing over 40 people.
Oh, that's incredible. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow. And so much of what we think about as it can't happen here, right? That these things happen in other places, and yet apparently the word settler colonialism cannot be used any longer, because to even teach settler colonialism, which I teach in a class on race and racism, is by definition encouraging an oppressor versus oppressed framework, as if that isn't the history of the world.
Right.
Which then leads by definition to some form of anti-Semitism, which is to say that, to Amelina's quote, one way of understanding the world can lead to people having a consciousness and awareness about how that way of understanding the world may apply in a contemporary moment. Last quote on this. The night of the sword and the bullet was followed by the chalk and the blackboard. The physical violence of the battlefield was followed by the psychological violence of the classroom.
Gugiwa Thiongo, Decolonizing the Mind.
Decolonizing the mind.
Amazing work.
Yeah.
I taught that in Ukraine, and people just loved it because the Russians are trying to eliminate Ukrainian identity, make it illegal to speak Ukrainian, say there was nothing there. They had no history. So it was the anti-colonial text that most spoke to Ukrainians.
Okay. So we've set the stage now for you, because I really, Jason, feel like you have spent years now trying to translate academic knowledge into general knowledge so that people really do have a way to understand the broader world. You've written about Erdogan in Turkey, you've written about Orban in Hungary, you've obviously written about Putin, you're writing about the United States within this context, you've written about Modi in India. I mean, for a place right now where I teach, 56% of my students are international students in a core class, one of the important points to note is that the United States is in fact not exceptional.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. That when you talk about fascist education, you are learning from not just what happened in the past, including in Nazi Germany itself, but learning the continuity, the dots that connect Jim Crow to Nazi Germany to Russia and so on. So floor is yours. Help our audience understand what is the threat to fascism when it comes to the very nature of education today.
Well, so first of all, just briefly on the causal connections between this. The country that Hitler in Mein Kampf praises the most is the United States. He says that's the national
It
state.
really is the most, over and over again.
Well, I'm thinking of one passage in particular that I quote in I think it's in his chapter Nation and Race, where he says the model of I quote this in How Fascism Works. The nation that has most closely approximated the national state I want to build here is the United States, where they've regulated immigration with health, exactly the things that Trump is talking about.
Right.
But obviously, as we know from Jim Whitman's book, The Hitler's American Model, the Nuremberg laws that took my father's citizenship away were based on the Jim Crow laws. My interracial kids were illegal in many states until 1967.
Right.
That's how much of an outlier this country is.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that was, so for this book, I looked at textbooks, both old textbooks and new textbooks, like the new textbooks that India's Hindu nationalists are putting out. And one of the things, but I mean, let me go back and start with Hitler's comments about education in Mein Kampf.
Mhm.
Hitler says, um, people have forgotten the art of education, of creating national pride. You should teach the great men of the race and show how they were the greatest men ever. And then people will look back on Germanness and they'll see that since these great men were German, that's what makes greatness.
Right.
So then another aspect of Nazi education. Hitler talks about this again and again. Classical education was venerated in Nazi Germany. And the reason was they created this kind of myth of whiteness that they then read backwards. So the idea was that Nazi Germany was the successor to Rome and Greece.
Hmm.
So really the Romans were, the great Roman emperors were really German, and maybe the ancient Greeks were German. And so this was the idea that you just had this one long-standing white race, German Aryan race, that was responsible, as Hitler says, for all civilization.
Right.
So, I realize Du Bois praises classical education in souls, but Carter G. Woodson is quite correct about the critique that you're literally telling people they have, other than, people in this venerable white male tradition, that they had no history.
Right.
And that's the crux here, telling people they have no history. Once you tell people they have no history, you can do whatever you want to them.
Mm.
You can take their land and say, this is a gift in exchange for which we're going to, give you civilization.
Right.
So this structure of education and then, think about the elimination of women from history, the representation in education system of education system of women as having no agency at all.
Right.
That's how I was, certainly the textbooks I was raised in. I mean, that's 50% of the population. So this attention to education, very central in Mein Kampf, very central in Nazi Germany, which was able to transform Germany into a not very anti-Semitic country by European standards at the time, to the most anti-Semitic country quite quickly. So and so this thing of representing the dominant group as the greatest in civilization, the greatest people in history, only teaching the work of representatives of them, and then robbing agency of citizens, making history seem like it's just the works of great men of the dominant group. This really, and then representing your nation as the greatest nation in history, a successor of Rome and Greece.
Yeah. I think you may have just explained why there are about 3 historians on faculty at the Kennedy School of about 200. Because for a school of government that teaches students from probably 100 different countries any given year, um, to some degree has engaged in a kind of American exceptionalism as an ethos that ought to be exported to the rest of the world
Absolutely.
as a way of governing dissent, managing scarce resources, justifying development economics where colonialism drops out of the story, and the failures of corruption within those governments is all that is left remaining. And if
Right.
only they would pull themselves up by their national bootstraps, these countries would rise to the occasion. I want to zero in on the US context. You provide a kind of context for the elements of fascism. I'm just going to read back your own definitions here. You say that there's a mythic, glorious past that is essential. Propaganda and anti-intellectualism are key to, I guess, indoctrinating the citizens to this mythic past. They are built on hierarchies of race or religion, and that resentment and victimhood, often couched in xenophobic terms of being replaced by an alien race, are there. Law and order is a key factor. Sexual anxiety. Cities are always decadent and overrun by vandals and criminals. And then, of course, there's coercion of work, that people are conscripted to do things that either they would not otherwise do or are done in such undignified ways that they amount to a form of human rights violation. So do I have these right?
Yes, those are the elements of fascist politics that the outgroup or the outgroups are always lazy and criminal. It's just remarkable how this nation, country to country, Myanmar, India with Muslims, it just goes country to country. James Sedanius, of course, has looked at this universal pattern. Um, so great replacement theory is utterly central. So the education system preps you for great replacement theory. It says, look, the great men of the dominant group are what made this country great. And so if you replace the dominant group, you're robbing the country of its greatness. So this system, what I worry about is the system of education we already have in place in the United States. If you were to script a background ideological conditions for fascism, this
It's
would
already
be
there.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think, I mean, I'm so glad you said that, because I think one of the things that this university, Harvard University, is guilty of, and I would argue it's probably true at many universities right now, is at least a sentiment that maybe people on these campuses did go too far.
Mhm.
And that somehow in the what 48 months since George Floyd was killed, maybe we're at 52 months, just to really lean into how little time has passed to that, that somehow the 1619 Project and all the anti-racism books and all the teachers who, started thinking about colonialism and writing about it and teaching about it in more fulsome ways somehow destroyed higher education and the nation, because before that it was perfect, right? Like before that there wasn't a politics of patriotic education that was going on before that, or these massive distortions.
Note that you said destroying the universities and the nation.
Oh, well,
What
right.
the hell does the nation? Those are two very different things.
Not anymore.
Exactly. So that's what you look at. That's exactly the thing I look at when I'm looking at from country to country.
Yeah.
I'm looking to see whether they're describing their university system in these nationalistic terms. Once you start to say the university systems are destroying the nation by allowing free critical inquiry, okay, that's democratic backsliding, to use a very polite term for fascism.
Yeah.
This is the causal links are also clear. Just a side comment: the RSS, the military wing of BJP, which is the political wing of the Hindu Nationalist Party that now runs India on the federal level, they explicitly admired the Nazis. They explicitly said, we're going to do to Muslims what Germans did to Jews. So this is not speculative.
Right.
So we have this. It's funny that you said George Floyd, because I was remembering the 2016 campus events when our students were trying to bring Black Lives Matter on
Sure,
the campuses.
sure.
So it's just like this, endless repetition, what the historian Elizabeth Hinton calls the cycle.
Yeah.
I mean, she talks about the cycle as, police brutality, then Black revolution against the police force, and then everyone agrees they're going to fix it and do something, and then somebody comes and says, oh, they're coddling the criminals, and then it all starts again.
Yeah.
So
which by the way, part of the theory of education, certainly in my classroom, is that the only way to disrupt that cycle is to actually see the cycle for what it is. And so closing down our ability to recognize historical patterns that might help us to predict, or in the case that what you're doing is to look across various countries and wide swaths of the world to see those patterns, is a necessary ingredient to actually anticipating the worst outcomes that we might face.
But I don't say that, because that's why they're doing it. So
right.
if you say, let's not give it away, Khalil.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Okay.
I mean, that's the vital thing
yes.
that we have to recognize
right.
in this moment. It's intentional.
Right.
They're coming after us. So it's not like you can't say what you just said, because it's like, Right, we all agree.
Yeah.
They're trying to.
But we don't all agree, and that's to me what is so remarkable about this. I mean, I can tell you, many people now know, if they didn't know before it's tuning in today, that of my class that actually is taught by a few different people, so I'm not the only person teaching the class on race and racism in the US context, along with a class on scientific racism and another class on settler colonialism across the University, Divinity School, Public Health School, were all singled out in the December 5th hearing by Virginia Fox.
I was proud of you.
Well, okay, so, not the list I was hoping to get on, but certainly matters.
There's going to be a
and-
lot of lists.
There are going to be a lot of lists, that's right. And the point there was to simply make the mere accusation that any form of racial consciousness that is piqued by history lessons is, in the upside down world of fascist, the real enemy of the nation.
Yeah.
Because of course the nation is otherwise glorious and colorblind and is not engaging in any forms of structural inequalities or systemic racism.
Right.
Okay, so you and me and most of our audience get this. But what the hell is wrong with the rest of the university? Harvard has, to this day, and I would argue probably no university, with some very rare exceptions, have actually said this is a lie. This is not what is happening in our classrooms.
I know.
Our faculty are not guilty of what the fascists are accusing them of. But I don't see that defense.
Our faculty are guilty of bourgeois liberalism.
Right.
and excessive centrism.
Listen.
But yeah, they're guilty of some things.
Right.
But
Yes.
but yeah, no, the university, we've seen anticipatory. I mean, we've already seen how bad it can get because of throwing everyone overboard. I think the theory maybe of the the theory of the communications director is to mask what's going on, the media team. Like, people say, I've heard from our administration, people like universities if they're described as science and scientific research institutions or medical research institutions.
Right, of course, because that is only the real basis for knowledge transfer. All these humanities is just, opinions and politics, right?
And it's also the case that that's like China's universities.
Right.
In any authoritarian country, there's no liberal arts colleges in authoritarian countries.
Talk a little bit about that, because I mean, you've studied this in a way that I haven't. I think many of us would be a little surprised that it's that plain. Is it really that plain?
What's a liberal arts college in Russia, in China, in Hungary even, which is in Europe? What would that even mean? You're not allowed to teach gender studies in Hungary. I mean, once you think about it, it becomes clear, because a liberal arts university is a place where you can criticize, you can do critical work into hierarchies. You can do critical work into whatever you want. And so that's just any kind of authoritarianism, not just fascist authoritarianism. China's not fascist, it's a different kind of authoritarianism. But, it can't have free and critical inquiry into its myths, because any authoritarian system relies on myths. And our system, what's so dangerous about now in America is those myths are already well in place. You have the myths that we're the greatest country ever, that God gave and chose America.
Right.
You have all those myths.
Yeah.
So if you're describing,
which by the way came through our liberal arts, right?
No, right.
But in an ostensible,
I forgot who I was talking to.
In an ostensible liberal democracy,
Right.
These were truths determined by the competition of ideas, right? Amongst competing schools of Europeanists and wannabe Europeanists as Americans trying to figure out which of the great Victorian writers was the best, saying nothing of any part of the rest of the world.
Well, then there's also your work about how universities promulgated racism. But you can see Du Bois always thought he'd get the Harvard offer.
Yeah.
Right, because he always thought, he believed in the ideal.
Yeah.
Even at in those decades when the racism was coming from inside the house, very loudly.
Very loudly. Okay, so I want to read something you put in the book, and then I want to ask you a question about it, which comes back to a point we've been hovering around. So you write about, first of all, the thing about this book, just for our audience purposes, I think is so important right now. You must have been writing this book right up to the day that the publisher said, if you don't get me that damn book, that book's never going to get published because you cannot keep writing, Jason.
Exactly.
I mean, it really feels like you wrote as much as you could right up to the very present. So there, it's very alive. It feels very present. And so you talk about Project 2025. You talk about the vision that the Heritage Foundation put in print, that Trump has disavowed, but we know from their own advocates promised to put in place. And I'm going to read here some of what is in this plan. So there's the Save American Education and Give Power Back to Parents.
Mm-hmm.
So here's what they're promising. Cut federal funding for any school or program pushing critical race theory, gender ideology, or other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content on our children, which essentially means whatever we decide is political content, you won't be able to teach, and we're going to strip federal funding. 2, create a new credentialing body to certify teachers who embrace not education and a marketplace of ideas, as Harvard is often so wont to say it wants to protect, but who embrace patriotic values and understand that their job is not to indoctrinate children, but to educate them. An inversion, right?
Totally incoherent, because patriotism is indoctrination. I mean, maybe you could have a kind of patriotism to values like freedom that wouldn't be indoctrination. But the kind of patriotism they're envisaging, America's the greatest country in history, it's all indoctrination.
A history that we know from social scientific research positions the founding fathers as an unadulterated group of men who were committed to freedom and liberty. And all the slaveholding that was going on was either not as bad as we made it out to be, either because they weren't as significant as slaveholders or because the slaves were actually happy.
Right.
And so it couldn't have been as bad.
I've got to say, the worst textbooks I've read are the American textbooks from like the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
They're so much more explicit than even the Nazi textbooks can be.
Which can explain a lot about the generation of baby boomers,
Right.
who were educated on these textbooks,
Right.
who are having a very hard time wrestling with the truth. I'm going to keep going. Find and remove the radical zealots and Marxists who have infiltrated the federal Department of Education. Couldn't be more laughable, the thought that people in the federal Department of Education are actually Marxists.
Yeah, they also say that professors at Yale and Harvard are Marxists.
Right. Yeah. And then finally, keep men out of women's sports, by which the plan means banning transgender students who identify as girls from participating in sports. So if these folks are as clear as they are in print, which I've just read, if you're as clear about what authoritarianism does to education everywhere, and has been doing for much of the past 100 years, then why is it so hard in this moment to expect, or shouldn't say expect, why is it so hard to find a robust public defense of higher education? Why does it seem like from the New York Times and major media outlets to higher education leaders themselves, to faculty on campuses, and generally to a public that has weighed in to pollsters consistently saying that higher education is going down, we have less and less faith in higher education. I mean, are we just too far down the rabbit hole of actually being defenders of a system that has taught us to be more patriots than critical consumers of information?
Okay, so yeah, there's going to be puzzles that we're not going to resolve in this conversation. And I think this touches this big issue of the role of higher education as a scapegoat for everything. Like, it's clearly become, as the quote from JD Vance, professors are the enemy. They're a useful elite. Of course, fascism involves business elite against cultural elite. So this is very old, like the billionaire class funds the fascists, who then represent the elite as the cultural elite, or also the financial elite, which I also have problems with. I mean, I can see this.
We talk about libertarian right and their objections to higher education as well.
Exactly. So, the targeting of the universities, obviously the defunding of public universities has hurt the reputation of universities among ordinary Americans, because, I mean, when I went to SUNY Stony Brook, paid like $800 tuition a semester in the mid-80s.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and maybe it was 1,500. No, I don't think so. It wasn't that much. So that has a big effect, the affordability point. The role of elite universities, like why are they constantly talking about elite universities when elite universities educate such a small percentage of America? Well, I think there's a lot of resentment towards elite universities, and I'm sympathetic to that.
Sure.
So the goal of defunding universities was to make them sort of kind of not be able to be plausible locuses of dissent. So I think you can see that in Reagan's first moves. A lot of faculty at universities, we're both faculty, we don't, there's a lot of white men that are like me, I'm a white, dominating universities who are probably themselves against a lot of this kind of critical history.
Yeah.
Because it undermines, the mediocre white man, as it were, paradigm. So we have so we don't have a robust defense of universities inside universities.
Right.
And so when we don't have when I stand up and say, or either of us stands up and say, this is when you stand up and say, this is exactly what universities should be doing. People say, this country, Israel is a settler colonialist state. What does that mean? What is settler colonialism? For what it's worth, I prefer to talk about practices and not like, is this X or Y?
Right. And I teach my students that all the time. And I said, when we get caught up saying America is a racist country, we kind of miss, we miss actually not just the details of what it is we're actually talking about,
Right.
but we miss the debate itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The debate is about which practices
Right.
preserve racial hierarchies. Just a note about the 1619 Project. It's a bizarre level of absurdity to accuse Nicole Hannah-Jones of not being patriotic. The whole damn thing is about why America is the greatest country on earth.
Right. Or in particular, her essay about democracy is about her own coming to a realization that she has as great a claim to this country as anyone else, and understands why her father flew an American flag outside of his home.
It's all about
her whole
Black
life.
Americans are the most patriotic people because America's
Yeah.
greatness is about Black people
Yeah.
too. And so the reaction to it, nothing demonstrates white supremacy more than the reaction to a project that is also American exceptionalism.
Yeah, yeah. You said earlier that in authoritarian countries, their universities are only really about science and about technology. And just to make a point, an observation that I hadn't really thought about until now, most of the published dissent for any teaching about race, racism, gender ideologies, settler colonialism, you name it, and critiques of the DEI work here at this university come from people in the sciences.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, the people in some ways you'd argue actually have the least expertise to actually judge the merits of the work. Are some of the most vocal critics of the work. They're not the only ones, but they are overrepresented.
Yeah, that's why I said, as we know, a lot of faculty within the university are behind these critiques, because the university is a battle for resources, and the scientists do kind of feel like all these resources for humanists, and they don't have, many of them don't have that kind of background. So that means, though, that it's tricky to unify university faculty against what is coming. We have to explain to all of our fellow professors that we are co-workers here and this is our institution, and we have to protect our fellow professors because they're going to be firing professors. They're going to be putting professors on.
They already are.
They already are.
Yeah.
Muhlenberg fired a Jewish professor for a critique of Israel.
For critiques of Israel, yeah.
So I think that message we can deliver to scientists, that because they're nervous about, we had a case of Yale of a scientist with connections to China getting in trouble with the government. So that sort of nexus, I've been on the faculty senate for quite a while. That was then suddenly a way for scientists to say, oh, they are talking about us too.
Right.
we just have to do that kind of work that any organizing involves, of organizing people with different interests and different backgrounds and explaining to them that the status of American universities as as the greatest university system in the world, the greatest university. Here I'm going to become American university exceptionalist, but
Right.
we are the greatest university in the history of the world, is at stake right now.
Yeah, is at stake. And by definition means that our capacity as a democracy to understand our reality that we face and to govern ourselves accordingly by picking representative figures who can guide us through our existential threats, be they climate change or forms of inequality, is at stake. Because if people are uneducated and don't appreciate education or are anti-intellectual, we don't even have the ability to have robust conversations about what comes next. For example, in the hurricanes with FEMA and apparently what is the word? Geo directing hurricanes to hit only red counties in Florida,
Right.
in North Carolina. I mean, it's just it's absurd, but you know, there is something to be said about a country that chronically miseducates and undereducates all of its citizens.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about elite universities, Yale, Harvard, et cetera, but this is just the tip of a much larger system.
Yeah, and I think it's just always important to recognize that's the point.
Yeah.
The point is to keep, if people are exposed to say, and it's so extreme now, as you say, like think of the state universities. Indiana and Ohio have passed these brutal bills directed against University of Indiana, which is one of the great
I
universities
taught
in the
there for
world.
6 years.
I
An
know. You and
incredible place.
Marcy
Yeah,
Short.
helped my career tremendously.
And now you couldn't teach there.
Yeah,
You
no,
have
it's a
um, so yeah, I mean, the I think, you know, when you go after concepts like structural racism, you're going after the concepts that explain, say, Black political protest. And so then people won't understand Black political protest. And when they don't understand Black political protest, they'll respond to it in a hostile way.
mm,
And so that's the goal, is to, and then we have this representation again. I mean, Toni Morrison described this long ago, and now we see this in play in the education discussions. That freedom for very often for Americans means white freedom. It only makes sense in contrast to the unfreedom of non-whites. So think of the image of the settler in the covered wagon going west.
right.
Image of freedom, but it's predicated on indigenous dispossession and genocide. So Moms for Liberty,
Yeah.
you know, think of LGBTQ plus children. You know, it's not liberty for them to be represented, to have their families represented as obscene.
Yeah.
And all these divisive concepts bills. You don't want to make even university students feel uncomfortable. Well, what students are going to feel uncomfortable? The black students will feel uncomfortable if you don't teach that material.
Yeah.
So it's like explicitly like safetyism for white heterosexuals.
Yeah. So I'm going to move to some questions from the audience. I wanted to read one of your quotes here and then connect this to K through 12. So you write, as fascist movements see it, any scholar whose research threatens the myths of national greatness, national innocence, or national purity can be considered a Marxist or a socialist, and therefore a national enemy. Because fascist education is exclusively focused on the glorification of the nation and its dominant group, any history lesson that presents the perspectives of minority populations or covers social movements such as the labor movement is antithetical to this project. So connect this to K through 12 because some of the people watching this are in K through 12. It's already in some ways been decimated by fascist politics, but just put it in your own words how we should think about K through 12 to higher education.
Right. Good. Well, first of all, there's a general push to create an authoritarian culture. What's an authoritarian culture? It's a culture where you're turning in your fellow citizens for not being sufficiently patriotic.
Mm.
So, you know, it's in 1984, for goodness sake. I mean,
Yeah.
this is this structure that they're intentionally generating of turning in your teachers.
Right.
So they're training children at an early age to detect other Americans who are not sufficiently patriotic or not sufficiently Christian and turn them in. So that's one goal we're seeing. And that's, if I were a fascist or an authoritarian,
Yeah,
I'd do that too.
yeah, yeah.
So then they're trying to rob students of give people the sense that history is done by the acts of individual great men. Martin Luther King gets thrown in because he ended racism. He supposedly ended racism, and so you have to put him in.
Which of course the fascists in their propaganda take credit for.
Absolutely,
Martin Luther King is
absolutely.
as much their hero
Exactly.
as ours.
Yeah, because if Martin Luther King Jr. didn't end racism, then why are we celebrating him so much? Besides just the one quote.
And if the country was so great, why did we need him in the first place?
Right, exactly. So robbing agency of students, for robbing agency makes people think that they essentially don't matter. And so that's an anti-democratic education. When we denazified the German schools, one of the major things was giving students agency, giving students a sense of agency, expanding the role of student government, things like this. So this sense of policing everyone, this sense of not teaching social movements from below is something that is obvious, and especially Black political protest, because that's been the center of so much social and political improvement towards democracy. Especially that you have to recast.
Yeah. So one of our questions is that are there lessons we can learn from the Chinese Cultural Revolution around effective ways to combat attacks on educators? What has worked in the past?
I don't know enough about the Chinese Cultural Revolution. It's one of my sort of weak points, because I was looking in my work. I look at fascism, which is one kind of authoritarianism. There are other kinds of authoritarianisms that have very different structures. They have very different ideological structures. They look differently.
That's
Like,
okay. But
yeah,
any others in the context
what
where
can we learn from the past?
Mhm.
Well, the Jarvis Givens here has done very important work, foundational work. Look at Amani Perry and Charles and Jarvis Givens's Black Teacher Project,
Mhm.
which they've digitalized.
Mhm.
So they're showing you what Black teachers in the Jim Crow South did to resist. Now they've got cameras in the classroom. They didn't have to face that.
Right.
But I think we can, so it's particularly heroic to be a teacher now because of the surveillance, the panopticon
Mhm.
that's going on. But what Amani Perry and Jarvis Givens are trying to do is they're trying to give us a model of resistance. So I think that's because we have that archive digitized. Givens is doing a lot of work just surrounding that. That's something we can learn from. Uh,
Which I just want to lean into for a
Yeah.
moment, because the example you're giving, just to explain, since many of our audience members won't know this work. So Jarvis Givens wrote a book called Fugitive Pedagogy, and the book looks at the role that Black educators in the Jim Crow period, so between 1890 and 1960, turned to a curriculum that would put Black people's stories back into social studies, would give Black students the sociology of racism and apartheid in America, so that they would not internalize the suboptimal conditions that they were living under, but would understand that it was structural racist forces bearing down on them, and that through these lessons they would understand they had the capacity to overcome them, often through collective action, but also through sheer will and resistance.
And also agency, they taught.
Right.
Slave rebellions, they
Right.
taught, of course, slave rebellions, John Brown as well, that gets eliminated in this
Right.
education
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
And so they kept the memory
Yeah.
of resistance alive.
And just to come back to the very books that you looked at in the 1950s and 60s, that said you had the most explicit narratives of American
The
white
most
supremacist
explicit, the most
patriot-
absurd
Right.
narrative.
were
most
precisely
absurd.
the textbooks that these Black teachers were supposed to be teaching
Right.
to their Black children, but often were subverted by the heroism of those teachers. I mean, one of the ironies of you using that example from the past to answer this question about what can we learn about what resistance looks like, one of the ironies is that our enemies, and I'm going to call it, they're certainly my enemies. These fascists are my enemies, and both as a citizen of this country and of the world, and as a person who is committed to truth and who practices by rules of facts and engagement. And I will let you know when I am imagining what happened in the past, just to be clear. But the commitment to teaching even Black resistance and Jim Crow has been subverted by the College Board and its capitulation to Florida around precisely some of these same issues. Because when Florida looks at Black resistance to racism in the Jim Crow period all the way to Black Lives Matter, they recognize, like the opening quote that we have, when you recognize one form of oppression in the past, you can recognize it in the present. And when you see resistance to that oppression in the past, you can mount resistance. They know exactly what they're doing.
They poll talk what DeSantis did in response to the resolution to the referendum granting felons full voting rights.
That's right.
Was to impose
the restoration of
tax.
voting rights, right, in Florida several years ago. Huge victory.
Huge victory, 60%. They were going to re-enfranchise like close to 1 million or 1 million felons, formerly incarcerated people. And DeSantis then said, okay, so Florida voted to do that by a large majority. And then DeSantis said, okay, but they have to pay their court fees.
Right.
And there's no way of finding out what the court, it's like a poll tax. It is a poll tax.
It is a poll tax. Yeah.
So, and all the stuff about the Heritage Foundation's director in 2021 said the Heritage Foundation is focused on two things: critical race theory and voting. And in other words, constricting voting.
Yeah. Okay. So last question. One of the questions from the audience is this: isn't this university, and I'm assuming here by this being Harvard, I'm sorry, no, I should read it as it is because it's not Harvard. Isn't this university climate driven by the money, the donors, et cetera, and how the right manipulates this movement to a fascist state?
Yes.
So, yes. so talk a little bit about that, because again, I mean, I'm thinking about people who think that the marketplace fundamentally is the best arbiter of value, right?
Elon Musk is definitely
but it's not even it's not even that. It's like, I'm in a broader community of successful African Americans, and not all of them, and not even maybe most of them, but some of them are sympathetic to these anti-tax arguments where they just want to keep as much of their money because they don't trust government. And to some degree, I can say this frankly, Black alumni at Harvard, for example, have had a hard time mobilizing in defense of Black faculty and administrators on this campus, because partly they think, like, if we give Harvard more money, Harvard will be kinder to Black people. It's a weird kind of way in which there's a kind of awe and fear in the face of rich people.
So Plato in the Republic describes political systems in terms of their cultures. He says, a democracy like Sparta is admiring a culture where the youth and everybody admires warriors and generals. Then he describes an oligarchy as a culture where people admire the rich most of all. And we live in an oligarchy, according to that description. We do not live in a democracy. If you're looking at political systems as cultures, we live in a culture where what's admired is wealth. And that means we live in an oligarchy. And so what to do with that fact, what to do with the fact that my young children admire super wealthy people, which is not supposed to be the case in a democracy. So how do we deal with that fact that we live in an oligarchy and we're tilting towards fascism? Those are the problems we face. And that's why we have schools and universities as central democratic institutions to try to change that balance, to try to represent leaders of the labor movement or ordinary people in the
Yeah.
labor movement as people we should admire.
Yeah, they're mediating institutions.
They're central democratic institutions because they're trying to transform the culture from an oligarchy into a democracy. And so what you're talking about are oligarchs or would-be oligarchs, and of course they're not in favor of that transformation.
In which case, as a parting thought, so goes education, so goes society.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Khalil. It's always wonderful to be in
Yeah,
conversation.
and please keep writing. Please keep telling us how to connect the dots between what is happening here, what has happened in the past, and what is happening in other parts of the world. I know my students who are participating today in this conference would have greatly appreciated your insight. Um, so I want to just turn to you, our audience, for joining us today. And thank you for your patience and participation and being part of our 6th annual Truth and Transformation Conference. This conference will continue in some form at Princeton University, where the IARA Project will find a new home in 2025. I just want to say again how much I have appreciated everyone here on the IARA Project team here at Harvard Kennedy School, as well as the Ash Center for Democratic Governance, for welcoming us into this community several years ago and helping us to do our work well with the resources and the support that any successful endeavor needs. And so I am personally very grateful for that. I finally wanted to just lift up a few of those strategies. We promised that we would offer some concrete advice about how to stand your ground against the anti-DEI movement. And although Jason and I talked a lot about higher education and talked about history and fascism, I hope that we made the case in this conversation that these two things are not related. That DEI is fundamentally about how you bring knowledge to bear on the work that you do in the world, and that the issues of inequality and inequity and injustice and misinformation and lies are real, and they affect every aspect of society. So whether you call that DEI, whether you call that equity work, or whether you have some other new name for it, the work is real and it's important and it is under attack. And make no mistake about it, we may wake up in 20 days in a very different country and by extension, a very different world. And so here are those strategies. We heard, and I'm just going to read them out loud from across the spectrum. We heard that we must fight with a sense of urgency. We must stay the course by not stopping equity work, by engaging in our own self-censorship or anticipatory compliance or anticipatory obedience. The law as it stands now does not prohibit equity work. We must fight litigation when lawsuits are filed, as is the case with the Fearless Fund and will continue to be the case with a number of other organizations. If you're in philanthropy, keep making grants. The inequities and systemic racism is real, as John Palfrey at MacArthur Foundation reminded us. There are 2 Chicagos, and the MacArthur headquartered in that city is committed to addressing that and to modeling for the rest of the country what philanthropy can do to make a difference. He also talked about supporting an ecosystem where philanthropy may in fact be supporting lawyers' committees or litigation funds in order to have the resources that people need to defend themselves against attacks. I'm sure there are some faculty members and administrators at universities right now who do need litigation support in one context or another. Additionally, be vigilant about the threats. Use evidence to justify your equity work and use evidence to track your outcomes. And Ayanna Parsons reminded us that representation matters in pursuing the benefits of diverse talents. It makes a difference, as we heard from A.G. Campbell, that her story, her lived experience informs how she understands the work. But I just want to say my own take on this is representation is not enough because we will continue to see people of color, as Jason Stanley reminds us in the context of colonialism, that collaborators were real people from those communities that were victims of colonialism who were then propped up to do harm to the very communities from which they came. And then finally, we must do this work together. We must do it collectively and not as individuals. It is in our collective ability to work together, to learn from each other, to bear witness to what each other is experiencing, that we have the capacity to not just survive this moment, but to thrive in the future. So with that, thank you so much. And I'm going to toss it back to Miriam.